That's the billion-dollar question, which is, can you tell the difference between something that's a flash in the pan and something which is an enduring form of social change? Now, if you look at post-COVID effects, I would say that, I think it's much more interesting if you disaggregate the data, because we saw this huge surge in restaurant going, sociability, pub going, holiday making, all those other things.
Yeah.
But I also think there's a proportion of the population who remain agoraphobic after lockdown.
Agoraphobic.
Fear of going out. Generally they're much more conscious, aversion to crowds, aversion to, social events. I think there's a subset of the population which has got stuck in the old behaviour. Equally, I think there are other behaviours that emerge from COVID, like flexible work. The idea that, I've got 3 Zoom calls and I've got 100 emails to do and I've got to write a presentation. Why would I need to go into an office to do that? That behaviour, I think, that new, effectively we have a new comparative frame where before going into the office was the default and you needed a really good reason not to do so, okay? Although that was actually never quite true on Fridays among senior people, by the way.
Yeah.
A lot of whom, before COVID, used to work from home on a Friday, quite commonly. But what you now have is it's no longer a default that you go into the office. You look at your diary and go, is it a good idea to go into the office tomorrow? Would I be more productive at home? And I don't see that reverting to the status quo ante at all. I think that's stuck. The genie's out of the bottle. The horse has bolted. I think attempts to say you must be back in the office 5 days a week. A Goldman Sachs can do it because they probably pay people enough for people to do.
Exactly.
You're already being richly humiliated in exchange for money. So this is just yet one further humiliation.
Yeah.
Okay. So they can probably pay people enough to do that. I don't think most employers who actually need to hold on to staff and for whom staff loyalty and commitment is important, I don't think most employers can afford to do that anymore. But what happens with trends like the vegan food trend is you get things which are flash in the pan, 9-day wonders. You get products like that when you buy them, you think they're amazing. But actually, my use of my Oculus Rift or whatever it is was fairly intense for the first few days and fairly negligible ever since. 3D TV always seems to be one of these things which is, it's got a great future and it always will have, And every few years there's this great surge in interest in 3D TV and then it ends just as quickly as it began.
What's happening there? If we talk about, right at the beginning, we're talking about sort of bees and collectivism and because I saw it come out of kind of nowhere. You had all these vegan meat brands bubble up. Mm-hmm. You had, and do you know the kind of the story of a lot of them? Basically, I think other than one, most of them are in decline now. They've gone into retail, hasn't really worked. You have some restaurants that have them.
In some ways,
in America it was huge, but kind of
the thing that probably will endure is that most restaurant menus will continue to contain a vegetarian option and a vegan option, which in many cases, of course, doubles the meat-free option for the customer. And as a consequence of that, by the way, I'm not vegetarian or vegan, but 1 time out of 3, just by the law of averages, I end up eating a vegetarian or vegan meal. And by the way, that's a perfectly acceptable way to reduce meat consumption, which is instead of a few people abandoning meat altogether, you have a lot of people. And actually,
that's you walking down the middle, though. That's what you say. People want you to. People
want you to make a stand one way or the other.
Yeah.
And actually, just as actually a perfectly acceptable response to the reduction of carbon emissions is wherever possible, use less carbon rather than we must have a net zero target by 20 so-and-so. An awful lot of change happens through what evolutionary biologists would call the adjacent possible. It's what you can do right now. In other words, it's not the theoretical ideal. An awful lot of kind of political movements start with something like communism, which is this is how society will work. This is how it will work better. And we're going to proceed on that basis. In other words, now, most progress is really evolutionary. You do what you can at any given time. And provided the direction of travel is in the right direction, what's the problem? Now, a huge amount of the reduction in meat consumption in the UK I owe this to a very good guy who's on Welsh Walty on Twitter, who did a lot of work with farmers. And the farmers would always say, well, of course, meat sales are down because all these bloody vegetarians, you see. And he did the research and said that actually the decline in meat consumption occasioned by people becoming vegetarian is relatively small. What's making the difference is a trend for food that contains very little meat. So if you think about it, if you go back 30, 40 years, your main meal would often be a big slab of meat with some vegetables alongside it.
Yeah.
And the main meal now might be a pizza, which has some pepperoni and a few little slithers of ham on top, but it's for the most part a vegetarian meal with some meat trimming. Okay, the meat is no longer the centerpiece of the meal; it's a kind of ornament to the meal. Okay,
yes.
Now so a pepperoni pizza, when you think about it, if you actually take all the pepperoni off and you stack them, it's actually not much of a sausage. Yeah. Okay, I mean, it looks a lot because it's covering the whole surface, but it's been very thinly sliced. And so the greater part of the reduction in meat consumption came through non-vegetarians eating meat differently and less, rather than a smaller group of people who are eschewing meat altogether.
So so it's almost like if you have this theoretical North Star, so i.e. say you could say communism, and then it's the adjacent possible.
Yeah.
Vegan meat is, right, we're going to supplant McDonald's burger. We're going to supplant the McDonald's burger. That's their kind of communist North Star.
That's in other words, it's a new reality.
Yeah.
We're going to impose a new reality.
And then the adjacent,
regardless of where Adam Smith says something about this, the idea that you can move people around as if they're pieces on a chessboard. The man of system, he talks about. And the point is there's so many interacting forces between the different people on the chessboard that you can't simply move from one equilibrium state to another equilibrium state without passing through quite a lot of intermediary stages, if at all, by the way. And then, so the idea is there's a graffiti, which I think it's Caitlin Moran quotes. And it's actually, even though it's actually a graffiti, or technically a graffito, I suppose, it's the singular of graffiti.
Really?
Yeah. But it's written on the wall of a toilet in Brighton, of all places. But strangely, in a way, it's a very conservative statement. And it simply says, start where you are, use what you have, do what you can. And that's a very good encapsulation of what you might call the intermediate possible. Now I'll give you an example. I'll give you an example of the intermediate possible versus the theoretical perfect. Okay.
So just to find those quickly. So
the intermediate possible, if you want to reduce meat consumption, is the pepperoni pizza. Okay.
Yeah.
That's the intermediate possible.
Right.
Full-on universal veganism tomorrow is what you might call the centrally planned sort of communistic approach.
Yeah.
In other words, one of them is bottom up. And it starts where people are with what they have and what they can do. And the other one is top down, and it imposes a new reality on people regardless of their situation, context, circumstances. So evolutionary biology understands this thing called the intermediate possible, which is where can you go next?
Yeah.
Okay. And it's more interested in some ways, as good innovation is for the most part, in the intermediate possible than it is in creating some theoretical dream world that exists only on paper. Most change, I would argue, and all of evolutionary change has happened that way. It's by exploring the intermediate possible. There's no capacity in evolution for you to jump intermediate steps. Well, okay, I better not say that because I'll have a few evolutionary. But broadly speaking, it happens through building and effectively, to use that graffiti in the Brighton toilet, it's start where you are, use what you have, do what you can.
So with linking this back to the vegan meat thing, is
yes.
Like that's the theoretical
there was
perfect.
A statistic I heard, which is that if Americans reduced their per capita meat consumption to the level of the UK, it would make more difference than if the entire UK went vegetarian.
Yeah, that's wild.
And there's a brilliant planner at Ogilvy called Matt Waxman, who's written about this on LinkedIn for, I think, Creative Review magazine, where he says that quite a lot of vaping rather than getting people to quit smoking. Okay, that would be an example of the intermediate possible. Another example of the intermediate possible would be you get people to wear condoms rather than getting people to practice abstinence. In other words,
the 10K steps a day. You know,
Yeah, that was exactly an example of that. Yeah. In other words,
5K couch to 5K was a great example.
brilliant example.
Yeah,
And actually, what used to happen, and we did quite a lot, I hope, to prevent this happening because it was silly, was you'd be going to people who, like me, are markedly unfit, and you'd show them images of Olympic athletes, okay, as like the perfect ideal of fitness. Now, to them, that is such. Well, first of all, anybody over 30, you're not going to make that level of fitness anyway, okay?
Yeah.
An awful lot of, particularly women, but also men, just not interested in the fitness thing. It doesn't make them feel any better. If they go jogging, they don't feel good. They just feel worse. There are an awful lot of people who don't like it. But as you rightly say, getting people off zero.
Is an
intermediate
in Costa Rica. That was one of the best things I've ever seen.
Sorry, did I say intermediate?
Intermediate possible.
Yeah. The better phrase from evolutionary biology is the adjacent possible.
Adjacent possible, but the two are kind of linked. I get it.
Linked, yeah.
But there was a place in Costa Rica, which is, as you say, if someone's we need everyone is obsessed with these extreme things, but actually most people want something along the middle, which is that middle ground. There was a gym in Costa Rica, and the name of it was like a kind of a workout class.
Yes.
And obviously, like, you're on the beach, and it's called Happy Hour. And I thought that's such a good name for obviously it was a play on the cocktails, obviously Happy Hour, and obviously you go there for an hour. And they said, and like this, the tagline was something like fairly hard workouts because you're on holiday, which is basically basically like you're coming here for a happy hour. You're going to do a bit of work out. Happy hour, play on the word.
It's fairly hard.
Yeah, fairly hard, and it is that middle ground. I think the names escape me, but I think
that's a great piece of marketing, which acknowledges the context in which the person finds
because
themselves.
Most people don't want these extreme things. And back to the first point.
My suggestion, which I never got Public Health England to adopt, was if it is true that genuinely having 10 or 15 minutes of aerobic exercise 3 or 4 times a week, was beneficial to their health. Why don't you just encourage people to have more sex?
Yeah.
Okay, because nature has already found a fairly strong existing inducement for people to engage in, reasonably vigorous, exercise.
Yeah.
Okay, which has its own inbuilt evolutionary reward. Why don't you capitalize on that rather than saying you just got home, you've turned on the telly, but no, you've got to go and get changed and put on ridiculous clothes. At the end of the day, you're getting undressed anyway. And I've often looked at interesting questions like that, which are, actually, how do you build on an existing behaviour or trend and simply accelerate it, rather than attempting to reverse a trend or to fight a trend head on?
Espressos is sponsored by supply chain software gurus Unleashed. It talks to your eComm and accounting software. It's helped islands cut admin time in half, get granular clarity on your margins, know where your stock is. Don't miss availability. Brands like Candy Kittens, Tiny Rebel, and Trip all use Unleashed, and so should you.